Between 1450 and 1750, the maps of the world were basically redrawn. You had empires clashing, entire new continents pulled into a global game, and all the old rules about who had power, yeah, those got thrown right out the window. So today, we're diving into this massive social reshuffle that completely redefined who was on top, who was on the bottom, and why it all mattered, all across the globe. Just think about that for a second. For most people back then, that wasn't some abstract idea. It was their reality. Your last name, your bloodline, that decided your entire life. But what happens when huge global changes? We're talking new empires, new conquests, new ways of thinking start to shake that rigid system to its core? Well, that's the story we're going to unpack right now. Okay, so our first major shift is all about how these expanding empires ran into a brand new problem: massive, overwhelming diversity. All of a sudden, rulers had to figure out how to govern people from countless different backgrounds and religions. And their solutions? They were all over the map, driven by completely different pressures and goals. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. Look at this contrast. Over in Spain and Portugal, the goal was absolute Christian unity, which led them to kick out their Jewish populations who had been there for centuries. But at the exact same time, the Ottoman Empire saw an opportunity. They actually invited these same displaced communities in because they knew they had valuable skills and would be great for the economy. So you have two massive empires looking at the very same group of people, and they come to completely opposite conclusions. But let's be clear, this Ottoman tolerance wasn't about our modern ideas of equality. Not at all. It was a very calculated, very pragmatic move. Sure, non-Muslims were allowed in, but their place in society was clearly defined. They had to pay a special tax, the jizya, which basically cemented their status as protected, yeah, but second-class subjects within the empire. Meanwhile, halfway across the world in China, the Qing dynasty had the exact opposite problem. They were a tiny ruling minority trying to control a gigantic Han Chinese majority. So what was their strategy? Total separation. They locked down all the top government jobs for themselves and forced Han men to wear that specific Q hairstyle, a constant daily visual reminder of who was in charge. So the big takeaway here is that there was no single playbook for this stuff. This table just lays it out perfectly. Spain wanted religious purity. The Ottomans wanted practical control. The Qing needed to keep their grip on power as a minority. And then you get someone like the Mughal Emperor Akbar, who tried something totally different. He actively funded Hindu temples and Christian churches, trying to unify his incredibly diverse empire through inclusion. All right, our second huge shift is all about the creation of entirely new power structures. As European empires stretched across the oceans, they didn't just find new land. They built brand new social ladders from the ground up. And these ladders were often based on some pretty radical new ideas about race and where you were born. And the most extreme example of this has to be the casta system in the Americas. See, not many of Spain's fancy nobles wanted to make the dangerous trip across the Atlantic. That left a huge power vacuum. And the new elite that rose to fill that void based their power not on old family names, but on something new: your race and your birthplace. And this was the rigid ladder they built. At the very top, holding all the real political power, you had the Peninsulares, the ones actually born in Spain. Right below them were the Creoles, people with pure Spanish blood, but born in the Americas. They could be super wealthy, but they were locked out of the top jobs. Then you had this whole complex system for people of mixed ancestry, the mestizos and mulattoes. And who was holding this entire thing up from the very bottom? The indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. Just a brutally clear race-based hierarchy, stamped onto an entire continent. But here's the thing. While these new elites were rising in the Americas, a totally different power struggle was playing out back home. In the big empires of the Old World, the traditional, land-owning aristocrats were starting to feel the ground shift beneath their feet as powerful rulers decided to centralize their own power. So in the Ottoman Empire, you had the Timars. These were the established aristocrats who held land in exchange for military service. But the sultans started to get clever. They began turning these land grants into what were called tax farms, basically auctioning off the right to collect taxes to the highest bidder. This meant all that money went straight to the state, cutting the Timars right out of the picture and draining their independent power. Over in Russia, the fight was even more direct. Peter the Great looked at the traditional nobles, the boyars, and basically saw them as a huge obstacle to his dream of a modern, westernized Russia. So he just systematically took them apart.
First, he created a table of ranks, which meant your status depended on your service to him, not your family. And then he just abolished the title of boyar altogether. Game over.
And in France, you see this brilliant, more subtle strategy. Louis XIV's incredible Palace of Versailles wasn't just a house, it was a political weapon. He forced all the important nobles to live there with him, trapping them in what's famously called a gilded cage. They were so busy with ridiculous court rituals and fighting for the king's attention that they had no time to manage their own power bases back home. Absolutely genius. So, let's just quickly recap the 3 massive shifts we've covered. First, empires came up with wildly different ways to handle diversity, everything from kicking people out to welcoming them in. Second, globalization created brand new social ladders, often based on the new logic of race. And third, all across Eurasia, powerful kings and sultans were systematically taking power away from their old traditional nobles. If this era teaches us anything, it's that social structures are not permanent. They can be shattered by war, they can be redesigned by new laws, or they can be cleverly dismantled by ambitious rulers. And that brings us to a really crucial final question. What actually makes a social hierarchy last? Is it the promise of inclusion, like Akbar tried, or is it rigid top-down control, like the Qing used in China? As this whole period shows, there's no single easy answer to that.